Hello, all. It's the sixth week of HPAM 625, and we'll be focusing on the role and selection of evaluative criteria in policy analysis. We'll also be taking a look at several key aspects regarding data quality, which we will develop further in subsequent lectures. This week's readings draw on and add some additional concepts to the core material from the week. The main readings covered the theoretical and practical dimensions around the selection and application of criteria and measures for assessing alternative options, both in public policy broadly and with examples closer to the field of public health. This session will have a brief overview defining the notions of criteria and how it relates to the process and practice of policy analysis. We'll address questions like, what are evaluative criteria? Why should we use them? When in the process should we start identifying them? Next, we'll consider a central question. What specific criteria do policy analysts typically use to cross-examine and assess different policy options to solve a given public problem? We'll take a look both at some of the commonly used criteria as well as some of the potential additional ones you might consider depending on the specific problem you're examining. Next, we'll consider what criteria should we choose? What are some of the parameters that can help us make the decision? Finally, the overarching question we'll address in part 3 is, how can we use the criteria in practice and make them ready for use in our analysis? What is the role of metrics and what data is best suited to support our analysis? And of course, these overarching questions speak directly to our learning objectives for the day. Recall that policy analysis is an iterative process, and the steps are not to be performed once and in a rigid sequence. Experienced analysts go back and forth between them and refine the different elements constantly as they progress from one stage of analysis to the next one. Rationale, part 1. What are the criteria? Criteria is derived from ancient Greek, meaning judging. In today's definition, criterion, a standard or principle by which something is judged, or with the help of which a decision is made. Remember that the policy analyst advises, does not decide in place of decision makers who rely on the use of reason and evidence. That criteria allows us to say that one alternative is better than the other. As quoted by Quaid, we can view criteria as the standards by which we rank the alternatives in order of preference, using the information uncovered about their impacts. Impacts are important, and the Bardak and Potashman, we are using criteria to compare the different projected or past, in the case of evaluation studies, outcomes of alternatives, not directly the alternatives themselves. Why use criteria? Recall from the readings, criteria are valuable tools for descriptive and prospective types of policy analysis. They are useful in both evaluative past policies or programs and assessing the potential outcomes of proposed yet to be implemented ones. Here we make note of two types, descriptive and prospective. Descriptive refers to either the historical analysis of past policies or the evaluation of a new policy as it's implemented. And prospective focuses on the possible outcomes of proposed policies. Another way to look at criteria is by situating them within the broader framework of problem solving and the progressive detailing of a given public problem, starting with the broad overarching goals and the specific objectives to reach those goals. Criteria point to the specific dimensions, such as effectiveness, efficiency, equity, political viability, which analysts use to evaluate different ways to achieve broader policy goals and objectives. They also dictate the specific measure that would be used to operationalize these dimensions in practice and compare the different solutions using a consistent metric, such as a dollar amount, a count of certain goods or service per capita, or per specific subgroup of the population, year, geographic area, and so on. Here, make note of the following definitions. Goals. These are formally and broadly worded statements about what we desire to achieve in the long run. Objectives. These are more focused and concretely worded statements about end states, most usually with a time dimension and a client population specified. Criteria. Specific statements about the dimension of the objectives that will be used to evaluate alternative policies or programs. Important dimensions include cost, benefit, effectiveness, risk, political viability, administrative ease, legality, uncertainty, equity, and timing. And measures. These are tangible, if not quantitative, operational definitions of criteria. Each criterion should have multiple measures associated with it. Measures can be used comparatively over time on the same problem or over space, comparing different places with the same problem, in order to judge how close alternatives come to satisfying the stated criteria. Why use criteria? The selection of the criteria and the judgment of the policy outcomes they help formulate is what also makes this step problem-solving process, according to the readings, the most important step for introducing it is the most important step for introducing values and philosophy into the policy analysis, because some possible criteria are evaluative standards used to judge the goodness of the projected policy outcomes that are associated with each of the alternatives. In the next part of today's session, when should analysts approach this step? When, according to the rational model, is the best time to choose the criteria? When in the process? You'll see the 6 readings from Bardak, Weiner, Patton, McCrae, Kraft, and Seavey. The answers are mixed, and there are different schools of thought. For some authors, including some we've previously studied, criteria are logically selected before identifying the policy options. For others, the opposite is to be preferred. So what's the value of postponing the identification of possible solutions until the criteria, at least in their broader form, are chosen? The answer is it ensures greater objectivity. When in the process? In the work by Patton and others, it is stressed that by stating the evaluation criteria before comparing alternatives, the analyst establishes rules to follow and reduces the temptation to rationalize favorite options. Seavey and others aligned with that position and emphasize the criteria for success should be established before you have completed your systematic review of policy alternatives. You might have to revisit your criteria after you have completed your review, but using the same criteria for alternatives keeps your analysis more objective. Developing the criteria after you have selected your policy or program could be seen as stacking the deck in favor of a predetermined solution. Part 2, the criteria. After establishing the meaning of criteria in policy analysis and how they fit in the analytic process, now we turn our attention to what exactly are evaluative criteria. Common criteria. The authors point to different to differences in criteria, but there are several common ones that are consistently referred to in the literature. Kraft and Furlong summarize some of the main ones in this week's reading. Effectiveness, efficiency, equity, liberty or freedom, political feasibility, social acceptability, administrative feasibility, and technical feasibility. Effectiveness is self-explanatory and is inclusive in that it judges alternatives on their promise to achieve proposed policy goals, or in the case of existing policies, the demonstrated achievement of the same. Efficiency brings in an economic dimension. It checks for the achievement of goals compared with the cost of each policy option. One option is considered more efficient if it either helps achieve the same goal at a lower cost, or if the cost is fixed and it helps communities get closer to the stated goal or exceed it at the same cost. That criterion of equity arises especially when the uneven impact of a policy, existing or proposed, is important. Equity is defined as the fairness or justice in the distribution of the policy's costs, benefits, and risks across population subgroups. We are not checking whether the benefits, costs, or risk of a policy are equally distributed among the population, but if their distribution is fair. Equity. There are different ways to determine the subgroup populations. Some of the common tests for equity include considerations about how the policy would or has affected different populations based on residential location, income class, race and ethnicity, age, gender, family status, home ownership status, and current versus future generations. Here are examples of specific variations and definitions of the concept of equity. Horizontal equity. Does a proposed program provide uniform costs and benefits to similar classes of people? Vertical equity. How people in different or unequal circumstances should be treated. How goods and services should be distributed. Transitional equity is concerned with how would the changed status of a good or service people own or have access to related losses be compensated. Intergenerational equity presents the questions of should present generations bear the cost of improved living conditions for the future generations? Consider sustainability, national health, and insurance programs. Other common evaluation criteria is liberty or freedom. Concerned with the extent to which public policy extends or restricts privacy and individual rights and choices. Political feasibility evaluates the extent to which elected officials, stakeholders, and other alliances accept and support a policy proposal. Administrative feasibility, also known as implementation readiness, is concerned with the likelihood that a department or agency will implement the policy well. Technical feasibility is a criteria relevant in instances where the availability and reliability of technologies is central to policy implementation. Additional criteria: legality, policy sustainability, progress, relevance, and impact. These are things analysts can consider and choose from based on specific needs of the policy analysis problem and feedback from stakeholders. Sometimes things are considered on a single criteria, such as equity or effectiveness. Commonly, analysts end up using a combination of several criteria. Which criteria and how do you choose among them? This brings us to part 3, which criteria? Criteria and the client. Sometimes some criteria may be predetermined by the client. However, decision makers may also not be willing to establish clear evaluation criteria and purposefully opt for more vague objectives, such as economic development, healthcare, or employment. This could be because they're serving the interests of diverse groups and not willing to alienate some and favor others. In view of inevitable differences between plan or implementation, they might not want to be tied to a specific solution or program. Types of policy problems. The type of the problem being analyzed can also guide the selection of criteria alternatives. Effectiveness, where virtually all policy proposals where concern exists over how well government programs work. Efficiency, regulatory policies such as consumer product protection, food safety, workplace safety, and environmental protection, considerations of market-based approaches. Equity, civil rights, disability rights, tax cuts for the well-off and or middle class, access to health services, and higher education. Liberty and freedom, proposed national identification cards, restrictions on internet use, property rights, abortion rights, regulatory actions that constrain choices of corporations and individuals. Political feasibility, any controversial policy, such as gun control, immigration, raising the gasoline tax, tax cuts for the wealthy, or subsidies for oil and gas drilling. Social acceptability, any controversial policies such as crime control or abortion rights, and from 2010 to 2013, healthcare reform. Administrative feasibility, the expansion of agency duties, use of new policy approaches or new technologies, policies with complicated institutional structures. And technical feasibility, science and technology policy, environmental and energy policies, automobile safety regulation, telecommunications, and defense policy. Different limitations regarding effectiveness. Effectiveness, or the ability of the policy to meet its goals, applies to all policy problems. When selecting this, it is important to keep in mind several limitations. Multiple goals and objectives. Programs usually have multiple goals and objectives, and it may succeed at some and fall short on others. Time. Some objectives may be attainable only over long periods of time, making assessment of short-term outcomes problematic. Uncertainty of predictions. There's a degree of uncertainty related to the need to estimate by forecasting future conditions and events the probability that a proposal will be effective or more effective than the present policy. Politics. Politicians often exaggerate the weakness of current programs and tout the strength of alternatives based more on ideological beliefs than an assessment of empirical evidence of program effectiveness. Different limitations. Limitations of evaluative criteria can be a worthwhile exercise when considering their choice and application in policy analysis. Effectiveness. Estimates involve uncertain projection of future events. Efficiency. Measuring all costs and benefits is not always possible. Policy decisions making reflects political choice as much as efficiency. Equity. The difficulty in finding techniques to measure equity. Disagreement over whether equity means a fair process or equal outcomes. Liberty and freedom. The assessment of impacts on freedom is often clouded by ideological beliefs about the role of government. Political feasibility. It's difficult to determine. Depends on perceptions of the issues and changing economic and political conditions. Social acceptability. It's difficult to determine when public support can be measured. Depends on saliency of issues and the level of public awareness. Administrative feasibility. This involves the projection of available resources and agency behavior that can be difficult to estimate. And technical feasibility. It's often difficult to anticipate technological change that would alter feasibility. Cross-cutting meta criteria. When deciding which evaluative criteria, the Munger reading suggests to 1, focus on ends, not means. 2, stated clearly enough to apply a measure of for how well it is satisfied by an alternative. 3, better if the criteria allows to quantify trade-off. 4, the criteria should be complete, that is, accounting for all the concerns expressed. 5, the criteria should be mutually exclusive, each addressing a separate aspect of the problem at hand. Part 4, how to operationalize. After choosing the preliminary set of criteria, they're probably not yet ready to be used in analysis, and there needs to be more elaboration. In other words, you need to operationalize. Bardak recommends be conscious of the different statuses of the criteria in mind. For example, values to be maximized and minimized, values that are constraints, values with the quality of more is better, less is better. Group your criteria into positive, meaning benefits, or negative, that's cost groups. Characterize if possible the criteria both in conceptual and operational, typically quantitative terms. Criteria to metrics. This table provides examples from Bardak and Potashnik. You see on the left qualitative descriptions such as maximize postpartum accessibility to family planning, maximize humane treatment of dairy cattle, or descriptions with quantitative metrics such as maximize the number of prevented unwanted and unplanned pregnancies within the first number of months after birth, or maximize the percentage of cows allowed to tend and raise offspring for at least X number of months after birth. Goals, criteria, and metrics compared with time. For short, the process of the evaluation metrics or metrics assessing the rise of awareness in the population. Were all students tested? Was a standard protocol used? Was the test conducted by a trained person? Midterm, impact evaluation, metrics that can include changes in knowledge, belief, or attitudes among certain populations. For example, have the students or customers been reporting they select, prefer, or buy healthier products and or follow healthier diets? And long-term, evaluation metrics that reflect actual changes in health conditions. For example, did the obesity rate decrease? Is prevalence of diabetes decreased? Are there less deaths that can be linked to unhealthy diet? Measures and data. The goal should be SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And the data measures should be available, valid, reliable, accepted, and collected at sufficiently frequent intervals. Assessing evidence, thinking through the sources of data availability to support measurement of criteria, some points about data quality. Validity and reliability of data are key. It's recommended for an analyst to critically examine the different data sources. Data collected, as well as how, why, when, and by whom were the data collected. And limitations in the data should be made explicit in the report. And that's it for this week. We went over criteria and how to choose and prepare for the analysis. Next session, we'll introduce two new tools: stakeholder analysis, relevant to political feasibility of policy proposals, and health impact assessment, which is designed to review the health impact of proposed or existing policies, programs, or interventions. Thanks.